Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we are stepping into a story that sounds impossible on paper but unfolded very quietly in real life. It is a story about abundance that led to fragility, about wealth that created dependence, and about a country that became rich faster than it learned how to stay rich. Before the chaos, before the shortages, before the headlines and political slogans, there was a moment when everything felt like a miracle. That moment began with oil. Our story starts in the early 20th century, when Venezuela was not yet a global talking point, not yet a cautionary tale. It was largely rural, agricultural, and modest. Life moved slowly. Wealth was measured in land, livestock, and harvests, not in stock markets or export figures. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Beneath Venezuelan soil lay one of the largest oil reserves on Earth, and once drilling began, the scale of what emerged stunned everyone involved. This was not a slow trickle of opportunity. It was a flood. Oil transformed Venezuela from a quiet exporter of raw goods into one of the most strategically important countries in the global economy. Foreign companies arrived quickly, bringing engineers, capital, and contracts written in languages most locals could not read. Governments relaxed. Expectations shifted. Oil revenue began pouring into the state at levels unimaginable just a decade earlier. Suddenly, Venezuela was no longer poor. It was rich, at least on paper. At first, the change felt entirely positive. Infrastructure improved. Roads were paved. Cities expanded. Wages in oil-related industries dwarfed anything agriculture could offer. For many Venezuelans, this was the first time prosperity felt accessible. The nation began to see itself differently. No longer a peripheral country struggling to keep up, Venezuela now believed it had skipped several steps of development and landed directly in the future. This belief became foundational. Oil was not treated as a temporary opportunity but as a permanent solution. The assumption settled in quietly but firmly: with this much oil, Venezuela no longer needed to worry about the old concerns. Farming felt outdated. Manufacturing seemed unnecessary. Long-term planning looked pessimistic. Why focus on slow, difficult growth when oil money could buy everything faster and better? The ground itself seemed to promise security. Every barrel exported brought foreign currency, and with it a sense that the nation was insulated from hardship. If food was needed, it could be imported. If machines were required, they could be purchased. If problems arose, oil money would solve them. This logic made perfect sense in the short term, and that was precisely the danger. As oil revenues grew, the structure of the economy quietly shifted. Traditional industries weakened. Agriculture declined as workers moved to cities for higher wages. Domestic production became less important because imports were cheaper and more convenient. Venezuela began to consume far more than it produced, confident that oil exports would always cover the difference. This transformation also altered the relationship between the state and its citizens. In many countries, governments rely on taxes, which creates a direct connection between public spending and public accountability. In Venezuela, oil replaced taxes as the primary source of revenue. The government no longer depended on citizens to fund itself. It depended on global oil prices. This single change reshaped politics in ways that would only become clear decades later. When a government does not need to ask its people for money, it also does not need to listen as carefully. Accountability weakens. Oversight fades. Decisions become centered around controlling revenue rather than building trust. At the time, however, none of this felt alarming. As long as oil prices remained strong, the system appeared stable, even generous. The early oil boom created a powerful illusion that wealth generated from the ground could replace the slow, unglamorous work of institution building. Schools, factories, and diversified industries were seen as optional when oil could pay for everything directly. This mindset spread through politics, business, and daily life. Oil became more than a commodity. It became a worldview. Venezuela's national identity began to change alongside its economy. The country was increasingly described not by what it produced, but by what it owned underground. Newspapers and officials spoke of destiny, of natural blessings, of a future guaranteed by geology itself. This language mattered. It encouraged the idea that prosperity was inevitable, not something that needed to be protected or managed carefully. And for a long time, the illusion held. Oil prices remained favorable. Revenue kept flowing. Living standards rose. Imported goods filled markets. Cities grew upward and outward. From the outside, Venezuela looked like a success story. Internally, it felt like progress. But embedded within that success was a structural weakness that few wanted to acknowledge. Oil income is volatile. Prices fluctuate based on global forces far beyond national control. Building an entire economy on a single export meant tying the country's stability to unpredictable markets. It also meant neglecting the skills, systems, and industries needed to adapt when conditions changed. The danger was not that oil existed, but that it replaced everything else. Oil money covered mistakes, delayed reforms, and rewarded short-term thinking. Each year of high prices reinforced the belief that caution was unnecessary. Voices that warned about diversification and sustainability were dismissed as pessimistic or unpatriotic. After all, why worry when the wells were still flowing? This early chapter of Venezuela's story is crucial because it explains everything that follows. The later crises were not sudden accidents. They were the delayed consequences of decisions made during this period of optimism. The country did not collapse because it lacked resources. It struggled because it relied on one resource to do the work of an entire economy. At the beginning, oil felt like freedom. Freedom from scarcity, from planning, from restraint. But over time, that freedom became dependence. And dependence, once established, is difficult to escape. As we move forward in this story, we will see how that dependence shaped politics, society, and everyday life. How prosperity built on oil encouraged habits that worked beautifully in good times and failed catastrophically when conditions changed. And how a nation that once believed itself protected by abundance, discovered that abundance, when mismanaged, can be just as dangerous as scarcity. This is where Venezuela's modern story truly begins. Not with collapse, not with conflict, but with confidence. With the belief that oil would handle everything. And for a while, it did. After oil transformed Venezuela's economy, it began to quietly transform something even more important, the nature of power itself. Wealth no longer flowed upward from citizens to the state through taxes. Instead, it poured downward from oil fields into government hands. This single shift altered how politics worked, how leaders governed, and how ordinary people related to authority. In countries where taxes fund public life, governments must constantly negotiate with society. They need consent, cooperation, and legitimacy to collect revenue. In Venezuela's oil-driven system, that pressure weakened. The state became financially independent from its citizens, and with that independence came a new kind of political logic. Power was no longer earned through service and accountability. It was maintained through control of oil income. This new arrangement created what scholars often call a rent-based state, though most people at the time simply experienced it as generosity. Governments could fund large public programs without raising taxes. Subsidies expanded. Jobs multiplied within the public sector. Benefits were distributed widely, especially in cities. For many Venezuelans, the state appeared not as a collector, but as a provider. At first, this felt like progress. Access to education improved. Healthcare expanded. Public employment offered stability and prestige. Oil money allowed leaders to promise rapid improvement without demanding sacrifice. Politics became centered around distribution rather than production. Elections were increasingly about who could promise more, not who could build stronger systems. This changed how political loyalty worked. Instead of forming around ideas, institutions, or long-term plans, loyalty became tied to access. Support followed whoever controlled the flow of resources. Political parties were less about ideology and more about networks. Power meant proximity to oil revenue, and exclusion meant distance from it. As the state grew richer, it also grew larger. Ministries expanded. Bureaucracies multiplied. Entire careers were built within government structures funded almost entirely by oil. This expansion was not inherently harmful, but it became increasingly disconnected from performance. Since revenue did not depend on efficiency or productivity, waste was tolerated. Mistakes were absorbed by high prices. Corruption, when it appeared, was often ignored as long as benefits continued to flow. Over time, the state began to overshadow society. Independent institutions struggled to compete with the government's financial reach. Private businesses found it difficult to operate without state contracts. Media outlets learned that criticism could cost them access. Civil society organizations often depended on public funding, limiting their autonomy. The line between government and nation blurred. Political culture shifted alongside these changes. Leaders were no longer judged primarily by their ability to manage scarcity, but by how effectively they distributed abundance. This rewarded short-term visibility over long-term stability. Large projects were favored over quiet reforms. Announcements mattered more than outcomes. Symbolic gestures often replaced structural change. Oil wealth also encouraged centralization. Because revenue flowed into the national government, power concentrated at the top. Regional authorities depended on transfers rather than local development. This weakened local accountability and reinforced a top-down model of governance. Decisions affecting millions were made far from those who felt their consequences. As decades passed, citizens adapted to this system. Expectations change. Many people came to see the state as responsible not only for infrastructure and services, but for personal economic security. When problems arose, they looked upward, not outward or inward. This expectation made political competition more intense and less flexible. Losing power meant losing access to resources, not just influence. This environment proved fertile for charismatic leadership. In a system where control of revenue equals control of opportunity, leaders who promised to fix everything gained traction. Complex problems were framed as moral failures rather than structural ones. Politics became increasingly emotional, personal, and polarized. Oil wealth also masked underlying fragility. As long as prices stayed high, the system worked well enough to avoid crisis. When inefficiencies emerged, they were covered by new revenue. When institutions weakened, oil compensated. This delayed the consequences of poor governance and reinforced the belief that fundamentals did not matter as much as control. Internationally, Venezuela's oil income amplified its political voice. The country gained influence beyond its size, using energy as leverage in regional and global relationships. This reinforced the idea that oil was not just an economic asset, but a source of sovereignty and power. Diplomacy, like domestic politics, became tied to barrels and prices. Yet beneath this confidence lay a quiet erosion. Institutions designed to manage conflict, enforce rules, and ensure continuity weakened from disuse. When systems are not tested, they do not strengthen. When accountability is optional, it fades. By the time warning signs became visible, habits were already deeply ingrained. The most important consequence of this period was not corruption, inefficiency, or even inequality. It was dependency. Not just economic dependency on oil, but political dependency on centralized power. A society accustomed to receiving found it difficult to demand. A state accustomed to giving found it difficult to listen. This dependency reshaped political expectations for generations. Every new leader inherited not only institutions, but assumptions. That oil would always be there. That the state could always pay. That solutions came from above. These assumptions became invisible, which made them even more powerful. As global conditions began to shift, the limits of this model slowly emerged. But by then, the political culture had already been transformed. Reform meant breaking habits that felt normal. Change required rebuilding trust between citizens and institutions that had grown distant. This chapter of the story matters because it explains why later political conflicts became so intense and so difficult to resolve. Power in Venezuela was no longer just about leadership. It was about survival within a system built around a single source of wealth. When that source became unstable, everything built on it began to shake. The oil era did not simply enrich Venezuela. It rewired how authority worked, how loyalty formed, and how responsibility was understood. And once those patterns were set, they proved far harder to change than any law or policy. This is the foundation upon which all later political struggles stood. A state strong in resources, weak in accountability, and deeply tied to a single commodity. The consequences of that design would not appear immediately, but when they did, they would be impossible to ignore. As oil wealth reshaped politics and power, it also quietly transformed everyday economic life. The change did not arrive as a shock. It came gradually, wrapped in convenience and confidence. With oil revenue flowing steadily into the country, Venezuela found it easier to buy what it needed than to make it. Over time, this choice rewired the economy from the inside out. Imports became the default solution to almost every problem. Food, machinery, medicine, spare parts, consumer goods all could be purchased abroad with oil dollars. This felt efficient. It saved time. It avoided risk. Why invest years building domestic industries when global markets already offered everything at competitive prices? Oil income made the world feel close and endlessly available. Local production, by contrast, felt slow and uncertain. Farmers struggled to compete with cheaper imported food. Manufacturers faced higher costs than foreign producers backed by scale and technology. As imports expanded, domestic industries shrank. Some adapted. Many disappeared. This was not the result of a single policy decision, but of countless small choices reinforced by oil wealth. The national currency grew stronger as oil dollars entered the economy. On the surface, this looked like success. A strong currency made imports cheaper and raised purchasing power. But it also made exports from other sectors less competitive. Venezuelan-made goods became expensive abroad. Even within the country, imported products often undercut local alternatives. The economy tilted further toward consumption and away from production. Urban life expanded rapidly during this period. Cities grew as people left rural areas in search of better-paying jobs tied, directly or indirectly, to the oil economy. Agricultural communities weakened. Knowledge passed down through generations faded as younger workers pursued urban opportunities. Fields were left understaffed. Output declined. Food security became increasingly dependent on ships rather than soil. This shift changed how people understood work itself. Employment connected to the state or oil-linked industries offered stability and status. Productive risk-taking, starting a factory, expanding a farm, investing in long-term output, felt less attractive by comparison. The reward structure favored proximity to oil money rather than innovation or efficiency. Over time, consumption became a cultural norm. Availability mattered more than origin. Supermarket shelves filled with foreign brands. Variety increased. Prices, supported by subsidies and a strong currency, remained accessible. The absence of scarcity reinforced the idea that production was optional. Shortages felt unimaginable. The government played an active role in this transformation. Policies prioritized distribution over development. Subsidies kept imported goods affordable. Controls were introduced to manage prices and currency flows, often with good intentions. These measures protected consumers in the short term but further discouraged domestic producers, who found it increasingly difficult to operate under constrained conditions. As production declined, the economy lost resilience. A diversified economy can absorb shocks because weakness in one sector is offset by strength in others. Venezuela's economy, by contrast, became narrow. Oil revenues funded imports, and imports sustained daily life. If oil flowed, everything worked. If it slowed, nothing could easily replace it. This dependence also affected skills. Manufacturing expertise declined as factories closed. Agricultural knowledge eroded as farms emptied. Technical capacity narrowed. When production systems weaken, rebuilding them later becomes far more difficult. Skills are not stored in warehouses. They live in people, practices, and institutions that require continuity. Private enterprise faced growing uncertainty. Access to foreign currency became crucial for importing inputs. Businesses without strong connections struggled. Planning long-term investments became risky in an environment shaped by price controls, shifting regulations, and currency distortions. Many entrepreneurs adapted by downsizing, exiting, or shifting toward trade rather than production. The economy became transactional rather than generative. Value was captured through exchange, not created through output. This model worked as long as oil prices stayed high and imports remained uninterrupted. It failed to prepare the country for moments when external conditions changed. International trade relationships reinforced this pattern. Venezuela exported crude oil and imported finished goods. This imbalance was normalized. Few questioned its sustainability because it had persisted for years. Trade deficits were covered by oil income. Structural weaknesses were invisible behind favorable numbers. At the household level, expectations evolved alongside the economy. Access to goods became a measure of well-being. Economic stability was experienced as availability rather than productivity. When shelves were full, the system felt healthy. Few people asked where those goods came from or what would happen if imports slowed. This mindset shaped policy debates. Economic discussions focused on prices, access, and distribution, not on rebuilding production capacity. Solutions were framed around managing consumption rather than enabling creation. The language of self-sufficiency faded from public discourse, replaced by confidence in purchasing power. The danger of this approach was not moral or ideological. It was practical. An economy that does not produce cannot adjust quickly. When imports become difficult or expensive, there is no domestic fallback. When foreign currency becomes scarce, consumption collapses. The system has no buffer. As global oil markets became more volatile, these vulnerabilities grew sharper. Fluctuations that once felt manageable began to expose gaps. Supply chains stretched. Delays appeared. The absence of domestic alternatives turned temporary disruptions into systemic problems. What made this moment especially difficult was that the loss of production had been gradual and largely unnoticed. There was no single event to point to, no clear turning point. By the time the risks became obvious, rebuilding capacity required time, trust, and investment that were no longer readily available. This chapter of the story is essential because it shows how abundance can quietly erode capability. Oil did not destroy Venezuela's productive sectors directly. It made them feel unnecessary. And what feels unnecessary is rarely protected. The economy that emerged was efficient only under ideal conditions. It functioned beautifully when oil prices were high and trade was smooth. But it lacked the depth to endure stress. When pressure arrived, there was little beneath the surface to hold it up. Dependence replaced production not because of neglect, but because of confidence. Confidence that buying was easier than making. Confidence that oil would always be enough. Confidence that tomorrow would look like today. As we move forward, we will see how this hollowing out of production intersected with political decisions and global shifts. And how an economy built on access, rather than output, struggled when access itself became uncertain. This is where vulnerability took root. Quietly, patiently, hidden behind full shelves and steady imports. And once exposed, it would reshape everything that followed. As oil wealth reshaped politics and hollowed out production, it also transformed the social contract between the state and its people. Over time, this shift became one of the most delicate and consequential elements of Venezuela's story. What began as protection and support slowly evolved into a system of expectations that no longer matched economic reality. Oil revenue allowed governments to promise more than previous generations had ever imagined. Education expanded rapidly. Healthcare access widened. Public housing projects multiplied. Subsidies reduced the cost of food, fuel, and transportation. For millions of people, these policies genuinely improved daily life. They were not abstract ideas, but visible changes felt at home, in schools, and in communities. These programs shaped a powerful narrative, that the state existed to guarantee material security. Progress was defined not by opportunity alone, but by assurance. Stability became something delivered, not built. This distinction mattered deeply, even if it was rarely discussed openly. As benefits expanded, they became normalized. What once felt extraordinary began to feel essential. Subsidized prices were no longer seen as temporary support, but as a right. Public services were expected to grow each year, not simply continue. The idea of adjustment or reduction became politically unthinkable. Social policy moved from safety net to foundation. This shift changed how people related to risk. In many societies, individuals balance uncertainty through savings, diversification, or private initiative. In Venezuela's oil-backed system, risk was absorbed collectively by the state. When problems arose, the expectation was not adaptation, but compensation. This created comfort in the short term and vulnerability in the long term. The system relied heavily on continued abundance. As long as oil prices remained strong, social spending could expand without visible trade-offs. But unlike diversified economies, there was little margin for error. When revenue dipped, there were no alternative funding streams ready to step in. The gap between promises and capacity widened quietly at first. Social programs also became tools of political legitimacy. Leaders were judged by their ability to deliver visible benefits. Success was measured in distribution rather than sustainability. This encouraged expansion even when warning signs appeared. Cutting or reforming programs risked backlash. Maintaining them required resources that were increasingly volatile. Over time, the language surrounding social policy shifted. Benefits were framed as moral imperatives rather than economic choices. Any discussion of limits was interpreted as indifference or betrayal. This made honest debate difficult. Structural constraints were overshadowed by emotional appeals. Complexity gave way to certainty. The state's role grew not only in scale but in intimacy. Government presence extended into daily routines through pricing, employment, housing, and access. This closeness blurred boundaries. When systems worked, the state felt protective. When they faltered, disappointment turned quickly into anger. The expectation of constant support reshaped behavior across society. Some people delayed long-term planning, trusting stability would continue. Others aligned their livelihoods closely with public programs or subsidies. Private alternatives weakened as public ones dominated. Resilience shifted from personal networks to centralized systems. As economic pressures increased, the strain became visible. Delays in services appeared. Quality declined. Shortages emerged in places once defined by abundance. These disruptions felt shocking precisely because they violated deeply held expectations. The issue was not only material scarcity, but psychological rupture. When people are accustomed to consistent provision, sudden gaps feel like injustice rather than change. Trust erodes quickly in such moments. Frustration intensifies because the system had promised certainty. The emotional impact of unmet expectations proved as destabilizing as economic hardship itself. Social inequality also took on new dimensions. Access to benefits often depended on proximity to power or administrative systems. Those inside networks felt protected. Those outside felt abandoned. This uneven experience deepened divisions and resentment, even as the overall system struggled to sustain itself. International comparisons sharpened the sense of loss. Venezuela had once been viewed as a model of social investment backed by natural wealth. As conditions worsened, the contrast between past confidence and present difficulty became painful. Memory itself became a burden. People measured reality not against abstract standards, but against their own recent history. The challenge of reform grew more complex with each passing year. Reducing subsidies risked immediate hardship. Maintaining them required funds that were no longer reliable. Adjustments needed time, trust, and communication resources already strained. Each option carried social and political costs. What made this moment especially fragile was that expectations had become disconnected from production. Benefits were not anchored to output or growth. They were anchored to revenue. When revenue faltered, the entire structure wobbled. There was no gradual adjustment mechanism, only sudden pressure. This fragility reshaped public discourse. Conversations about policy became emotional rather than analytical. Blame replaced planning. Responsibility became a contested concept. Structural causes were overshadowed by personal narratives of loss and betrayal. Yet it is important to understand that these expectations were not irrational. They were built logically, over decades, through lived experience. When the state consistently provides, people trust it will continue to do so. The tragedy lies not in the trust itself, but in the system's inability to sustain it. This chapter of the story reveals how social success can become a vulnerability when it outpaces economic foundation. Progress built on unstable ground carries hidden risks. When conditions change, what once united can quickly divide. The erosion of trust that followed was not immediate. It accumulated through small disappointments, delayed responses, and unmet assurances. Each moment chipped away at confidence until the relationship between state and society felt strained and uncertain. Understanding this dynamic is essential to understanding everything that follows. Economic collapse alone does not explain the depth of Venezuela's crisis. It was the collision between expectation and reality that amplified its impact. As we continue, we will see how these fragile expectations interacted with political decisions, global shifts, and institutional weaknesses. And how a system designed to protect eventually struggled to adapt, not because it lacked compassion, but because it lacked balance. This is where hope began to feel conditional. where certainty faded, and where the promise of abundance gave way to the challenge of adjustment, one expectation at a time. For years, Venezuela's system functioned on a shared belief that external conditions would remain favorable. Oil prices might rise or fall, but they were expected to stay within a range that kept the engine running. This assumption was rarely stated outright, yet it shaped nearly every major decision. When global conditions finally shifted in ways the system could not absorb, the consequences were swift and unforgiving. Oil markets are influenced by forces far beyond any single country's control. Technological changes, new producers, geopolitical tensions, and shifts in global demand all affect prices. For diversified economies, these fluctuations are manageable. For an economy built around one primary export, they are defining. When prices dropped sharply, Venezuela's margin for error disappeared. The immediate impact was fiscal. Government revenue fell rapidly, while spending commitments remained high. Social programs, subsidies, public employment, and imports had been structured around years of higher income. Adjusting them was not just economically difficult, but politically explosive. The gap between income and obligation widened almost overnight. Foreign currency shortages followed. Because imports were central to daily life, reduced access to dollars disrupted supply chains across the economy. Goods that had once been routine became delayed or scarce. The system had been optimized for abundance, not constraint. When abundance vanished, there was no alternative pathway ready to activate. Currency controls, introduced earlier to manage capital flows, intensified these pressures. Multiple exchange rates distorted incentives and encouraged speculation. Access to foreign currency became uneven, often favoring those with connections or administrative leverage. This deepened inequality and fueled resentment, even as the overall supply shrank. Businesses dependent on imported inputs struggled to operate. Production slowed or stopped. Shelves emptied not because demand disappeared, but because supply could no longer move smoothly. Each disruption reinforced the next. Delays compounded. Trust eroded between producers, distributors, and consumers. The psychological impact of these changes was profound. Scarcity contradicted decades of lived experience. People had been accustomed to availability, choice, and stability. Sudden disruption felt disorienting. Daily routines became unpredictable. Planning ahead grew difficult. Anxiety spread faster than shortages themselves. Global perceptions also shifted. Venezuela's reputation as a reliable supplier and stable economy weakened. Credit tightened. International partners became cautious. Access to financing narrowed just as the need for flexibility increased. External pressure magnified internal strain. Political responses struggled to keep pace. Measures designed for short-term relief often created longer-term distortions. Price controls aimed at protecting consumers discouraged suppliers. Emergency fixes replaced structural reform. Each intervention addressed symptoms while leaving underlying vulnerabilities intact. Blame became a central feature of public discourse. External forces were cited, sometimes accurately, sometimes selectively. Internal mismanagement was debated fiercely. What mattered most, however, was not assigning fault, but recognizing that the system itself had been built without shock absorbers. Households adapted in uneven ways. Some relied on savings or informal networks. Others reduced consumption sharply. Many turned to coping strategies that prioritized immediacy over long-term security. The social fabric stretched as communities absorbed pressures once handled by institutions. Inequality became more visible. Those with access to foreign currency or international connections navigated disruptions more easily. Those without faced steeper challenges. The sense that the system no longer treated everyone equally intensified frustration and distrust. The global shock did not create Venezuela's vulnerabilities. It revealed them. It exposed how deeply the economy depended on a narrow set of assumptions: stable prices, uninterrupted imports, and centralized distribution. When those assumptions failed, the system had little room to adjust gradually. Institutional weakness became harder to ignore. Agencies designed to manage crises lacked coordination or credibility. Data became scarce. Communication faltered. Uncertainty fed speculation, which further destabilized markets. The feedback loop tightened. International comparisons returned, but now with a different tone. Countries that had diversified earlier weathered the same global shifts with less disruption. This contrast sharpened the sense of missed opportunity. The cost of past confidence became visible in present difficulty. What made recovery especially challenging was timing. Reforms that might have been manageable during years of abundance now required sacrifice during scarcity. Trust, already strained, made collective adjustment harder. Every proposal was met with suspicion. Every delay deepened doubt. Yet even in this period, resilience appeared in unexpected places. Informal economies adapted quickly. Community networks filled gaps where formal systems faltered. People found ways to navigate constraints, though often at personal cost. Survival became a daily exercise in creativity. This chapter marks the moment when Venezuela's challenges shifted from latent to explicit. The system could no longer hide behind favorable conditions. Global forces acted like a stress test, revealing where strength had been assumed rather than built. Understanding this moment is essential because it reframes the crisis. It was not simply the result of bad luck or hostile markets. It was the consequence of long-standing design choices meeting a changing world. When conditions shifted, the lack of flexibility became decisive. As we move forward, the story becomes less about external shocks and more about internal response. How institutions reacted, how politics adapted, and how society coped under sustained pressure. The global trigger mattered, but what followed was shaped at home. This is where inevitability began to replace confidence. Where assumptions met reality. And where a system built for certainty was forced to confront uncertainty it had never learned how to manage. The shock did not end quickly. It lingered, reshaping behavior and expectations. And once exposed, the weaknesses it revealed could not be unseen. As global shocks tightened their grip, the pressure moved from markets into institutions. Systems that had once functioned quietly in the background were suddenly expected to manage scarcity, conflict, and uncertainty all at once. This was the moment when capacity mattered most and when long-standing weaknesses became impossible to ignore. Institutions are built for routine before they are tested by crisis. In Venezuela, many had grown accustomed to operating in an environment of abundance. Processes were designed for distribution, not prioritization. Rules assumed availability, not shortage. When conditions changed, these systems struggled to adapt quickly or transparently. Administrative delays multiplied. Decisions that once felt automatic now required approvals, exceptions, and improvisation. The absence of reliable data complicated planning. Without clear information, policies were based on estimates and assumptions, which reduced their effectiveness and credibility. Uncertainty fed further uncertainty. Public services felt the strain directly. Maintenance schedules slipped. Staffing became inconsistent. Quality varied widely from place to place. For citizens, these changes were experienced not as abstract institutional challenges, but as daily disruptions. Small failures accumulated, altering how people judged the system as a whole. Trust, once lost, rarely disappears overnight. It erodes through repetition. A late delivery here. A conflicting announcement there. An unmet promise followed by silence. Each instance seemed manageable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern that reshaped expectations. Communication became a critical fault line. In moments of stress, people look for clarity and consistency. Mixed messages, delayed explanations, or overly confident assurances undermined confidence. When reality diverged from official statements, skepticism grew. Information gaps were filled by rumor, speculation, and fear. The relationship between citizens and institutions shifted subtly. Compliance became conditional. Rules were followed when they aligned with survival needs and bypassed when they did not. Informal solutions expanded to compensate for formal delays. This adaptation was rational, but it further weakened institutional authority. Professional capacity also declined under pressure. Skilled workers faced difficult choices. Some sought opportunities elsewhere. Others remained but struggled with limited resources and uncertainty. Institutional memory thinned. Training pipelines slowed. Each departure made recovery harder. Legal and regulatory frameworks faced similar strain. Designed for stability, they were tested by rapid change. Enforcement became uneven. Exceptions multiplied. Predictability, a cornerstone of trust, weakened. When outcomes feel arbitrary, confidence in fairness declines. Economic stress amplified these dynamics. As livelihoods became uncertain, patience shortened. Disputes escalated more quickly. Administrative errors felt personal. The emotional weight of scarcity intensified. Reactions to institutional failure. The private sector mirrored these challenges. Businesses navigating unpredictable rules and limited inputs faced planning paralysis. Long-term investment felt risky. Short-term survival dominated decision-making. This further reduced economic activity, feeding back into institutional stress. Community organizations attempted to bridge gaps. Local networks coordinated resources, shared information, and provided support. While these efforts demonstrated resilience, they also highlighted the limits of formal systems. Reliance on informal solutions became normalized. Over time, legitimacy itself came into question. Institutions are trusted not because they are perfect, but because they are seen as capable of learning and correcting. When correction appears slow or absent, doubt spreads. Even effective actions are interpreted through a lens of skepticism. The challenge of reform grew more complex under these conditions. Changes that might have improved capacity required coordination, time, and trust, all in short supply. Every adjustment risked unintended consequences. Every delay reinforced frustration. Generational differences emerged. Older citizens compared current instability with past predictability. Younger ones formed expectations in an environment of uncertainty. This divergence shaped attitudes toward authority, opportunity, and responsibility. International engagement reflected similar patterns. Partners sought reliability and transparency. Inconsistency reduced cooperation. Isolation increased the burden on domestic institutions already under strain. What made this period especially consequential was its cumulative effect. No single failure defined it. The impact lay in accumulation. Each unresolved issue narrowed the space for recovery. Each misstep reduced the margin for error. Yet even here, the story is not one of total collapse. Many individuals within institutions continued to work with commitment and creativity. Systems bent, adapted, and held in places. The erosion of trust was uneven, not universal. Understanding this chapter is essential because it explains why later efforts faced resistance even when intentions improved. Trust is not restored by declaration. It requires consistency over time. In an environment of continued pressure, rebuilding that consistency was extraordinarily difficult. This is where the crisis became relational, not just economic. Where the question shifted from will this work, to can this be trusted? And where recovery depended not only on resources, but on rebuilding confidence between people and the structures meant to serve them. As the story continues, the focus moves toward how prolonged strain reshaped behavior, choices, and identity. Institutions did not simply weaken. They changed the way society interacted with them. And that change would influence every chapter that followed. As institutional strain persisted, the effects moved deeper into everyday life. What had begun as economic disruption and administrative difficulties slowly evolved into a transformation of behavior, habits, and social norms. Prolonged pressure does more than limit choices. It changes how people think, plan, and relate to one another. Daily routines became exercises in adaptation. Tasks once taken for granted required preparation and flexibility. Timing mattered more. Information became valuable. People learned to anticipate delays and adjust expectations. Life began to revolve around availability rather than preference. This shift altered how time was experienced. Waiting became common. Planning far ahead felt risky. Short-term thinking, once a coping strategy, gradually became a default mindset. When outcomes feel uncertain, immediacy takes priority. The future narrows. Social networks gained importance. Family, friends, and neighbors became essential sources of support and information. Informal coordination filled gaps left by formal systems. Trust migrated from institutions to personal relationships. Who you knew often mattered as much as what you knew. These networks strengthened bonds but also created uneven experiences. Those with wider connections navigated challenges more effectively. Those without felt exposed. Social capital became a form of resilience, unevenly distributed and deeply influential. Markets adapted in visible ways. Informal exchange expanded. Barter reappeared where currency access was limited. Creativity flourished alongside necessity. People repurposed skills, shared resources, and found unconventional solutions. Adaptation was constant, but it came at a cost. Stress accumulated quietly. Uncertainty taxed emotional reserves. Small disruptions carried heavier weight. Decision fatigue became common as people navigated countless trade-offs. The mental load of daily adaptation shaped mood, relationships, and outlook. Trust between strangers shifted. Cooperation increased in some contexts and declined in others. Shared difficulty fostered solidarity within groups, while competition for scarce resources heightened tension between them. Social cohesion became situational. Work patterns changed. Formal employment felt less stable. Informal income streams gained prominence. Flexibility mattered more than specialization. This adaptability helped families cope, but it also reduced predictability and long-term security. Education faced unique challenges. Interruptions altered learning rhythms. Families adjusted priorities. Skills learned informally sometimes replaced structured pathways. The meaning of progress shifted from credentials to competence and survival. Health behaviors reflected similar trade-offs. Prevention became harder when resources were constrained. Care decisions weighed immediacy against availability. Community support played a growing role in managing well-being. Cultural expression responded to pressure in subtle ways. Humor adapted. Storytelling emphasized resilience. Art reflected uncertainty and endurance. These expressions helped process experience and maintain identity amid change. Media consumption shifted as well. People sought practical information and reassurance. Credibility mattered more than polish. Trust followed consistency and usefulness rather than authority alone. Generational perspectives diverged further. Older individuals anchored expectations in memory. Younger ones calibrated ambition to constraint. Each group interpreted stability differently, shaping attitudes toward risk and opportunity. Migration entered daily conversation. For some, it represented possibility. For others, loss. Decisions were rarely simple. They involved identity, belonging, and uncertainty layered upon uncertainty. Despite pressure, norms of care persisted. Mutual aid emerged in practical forms. Shared meals, shared transport, shared knowledge. These acts sustained communities even as systems faltered. Yet adaptation carried long-term consequences. Constant improvisation eroded patience for rules perceived as inflexible. Informality normalized. Reversing this shift would later require rebuilding not just systems but habits. This period reshaped what felt normal. Scarcity altered reference points. Satisfaction recalibrated. Stability was redefined not as abundance, but as predictability, however modest. The emotional landscape shifted alongside behavior. Hope became cautious. Optimism became conditional. Resilience grew, but so did fatigue. The capacity to endure expanded even as the desire for relief intensified. Importantly, these changes were not uniform. Experience varied by region, community, and circumstance. Some adapted faster. Others struggled longer. The diversity of response complicates simple narratives. Understanding this chapter means recognizing that crises live in routines. They shape how mornings begin, how evenings end, and how decisions are made in between. Over time, these patterns solidify. When pressure persists, it leaves a mark. It changes expectations of institutions, of markets, and of one another. Recovery, when it comes, must address not only structures, but the behaviors shaped under strain. This is where the story turns inward. Where adaptation becomes identity. And where the challenge ahead is not merely restoring capacity, but reshaping norms formed in survival mode. As the narrative continues, the focus shifts to how leadership and policy interacted with this transformed social landscape. Decisions made at the top now met a society changed by experience. And that interaction would define what came next. By the time leadership decisions attempted to respond to deepening strain, the society they addressed was no longer the one that had existed during years of abundance. Daily life had been reshaped by adaptation. Trust had shifted away from institutions, and expectations had narrowed toward immediacy and survival. Policies were no longer meeting a neutral audience. They were meeting people already conditioned by uncertainty. Leadership in this context faced an unusually complex task. Decisions were made under pressure, with limited resources and shrinking margins. Yet the environment demanded not only technical solutions, but emotional intelligence. People did not just need policies. They needed reassurance, clarity, and credibility, qualities that had become scarce. Policy tools that might have worked in earlier decades now produced mixed results. Measures designed to stabilize prices or ensure access often collided with informal systems that had grown in their absence. Attempts to reassert control encountered resistance not necessarily rooted in opposition, but in lived experience. People had learned to rely on flexibility. Rigid solutions felt disconnected from reality. Messaging became as important as mechanics. Announcements were scrutinized for consistency with daily experience. When words did not align with outcomes, skepticism deepened. Confidence could not be restored through declarations alone. It required follow-through in an environment where patience was limited. Leadership styles mattered more than ever. Centralized decision-making promised speed, but risked misreading local conditions. Decentralized approaches offered responsiveness, but required trust and coordination that were difficult to rebuild. Each path carried trade-offs, and missteps were amplified by public fatigue. Political narratives grew sharper as space for nuance narrowed. Complex structural challenges were framed as simple conflicts. This provided clarity for some, but reduced room for compromise. Polarization intensified not only at the political level, but within communities shaped by different coping strategies. Economic policy faced similar constraints. Long-term reforms demanded short-term sacrifice. Yet households already operating at the edge had little capacity to absorb further adjustment. Timing became critical. Even well-designed changes risked backlash if introduced without visible buffers. Institutions tasked with implementation struggled to keep pace. Capacity gaps persisted. Coordination faltered. Each delay reinforced perceptions of disconnect between leadership intent and institutional ability. The gap between plan and practice became a central challenge. International engagement reflected these dynamics. External partnerships required predictability and trust. Negotiations unfolded against a backdrop of domestic pressure. Concessions were politically sensitive. Isolation carried costs, but integration demanded reforms that were socially difficult. Leadership also confronted a transformed media environment. Information traveled quickly, often without verification. Narratives competed in real time. Credibility was contested constantly. Managing perception became inseparable from managing policy. Social cohesion, already strained, influenced response to leadership decisions. In communities where trust remained, policies gained traction. Where trust had eroded, even beneficial measures faced skepticism. The uneven social landscape produced uneven outcomes. Generational perspectives further complicated the picture. Younger people evaluated leadership through present experience rather than historical comparison. Older generations measured decisions against memory. These differing reference points shaped reactions to the same policies. What made this period especially consequential was path dependence. Choices made under pressure shaped future options. Temporary measures risked becoming permanent habits. Emergency responses hardened into expectations. The window for gradual reform narrowed. Yet leadership was not acting in a vacuum. Constraints were real. Resources were limited. Options were imperfect. Judging decisions without acknowledging context risks oversimplification. The challenge lay not only in choice, but in timing, communication, and alignment with a changed society. Some initiatives aimed to rebuild capacity from the ground up. Others focused on stabilization. Success varied. Where policy aligned with lived reality, it found support. Where it ignored adaptive behaviors, it struggled. The interplay between leadership and society became a feedback loop. Policy influenced behavior. Behavior reshaped policy effectiveness. Misalignment amplified friction. Alignment created pockets of progress, even amid broader difficulty. This chapter underscores a critical lesson. Crises change people before policies catch up. By the time leadership responds, the audience has already adapted. Effective governance must meet people where they are, not where they once were. Understanding this moment helps explain why outcomes were uneven and why reform proved so difficult. It was not simply a matter of will or ideology. It was the challenge of steering a system while the ground beneath it continued to shift. As the story continues, attention turns to the long-term consequences of these interactions. How temporary adaptations became lasting patterns. How choices made under strain shaped future possibilities. And how recovery, when envisioned, had to reckon with a society transformed by experience. This is where the narrative moves from response to consequence. from immediate decision to lasting impact, and from leadership intent to the deep imprint left on institutions, norms, and expectations that would define the road ahead. As years of pressure accumulated, many of the adjustments people made to cope with uncertainty began to solidify. What started as temporary solutions slowly turned into stable habits. This shift marked a critical turning point, because systems can recover faster than behaviors. When adaptation becomes routine, it reshapes how society functions even after conditions change. Informality, once a response to disruption, became embedded in daily life. People learned to bypass slow or unpredictable processes, relying instead on personal networks and improvised exchanges. These methods were efficient under stress, but they also reduced reliance on formal rules. Over time, the expectation that recovery would restore previous norms weakened. Economic behavior reflected this change. Short-term decision-making became rational, even dominant. Saving for distant goals felt risky when conditions could change quickly. Investment horizons shortened. Flexibility mattered more than stability. These choices helped households survive, but they also reduced the economy's capacity to plan and grow. Work patterns followed a similar path. Informal employment expanded not only out of necessity, but because it offered autonomy in an uncertain environment. Predictable schedules and fixed pathways felt less realistic. Skills diversified horizontally rather than deepening vertically. Adaptability replaced specialization. These shifts altered incentives across society. Compliance with formal systems depended increasingly on immediate benefit. When rules aligned with survival, they were followed. When they conflicted, they were ignored. This conditional engagement weakened the authority of institutions, even when conditions improved in specific areas. Trust recalibrated permanently for many people. Instead of assuming systems would function, individuals learned to verify, hedge, and prepare alternatives. Optimism became cautious. Confidence became situational. This mindset reduced vulnerability, but it also made collective action harder. Education outcomes reflected these dynamics. Learning remained valued, but pathways diversified. Informal skill acquisition gained importance. Credentials mattered less than competence. While this produced resilience, it also complicated reintegration into formal labor markets designed around traditional markers. Migration decisions left lasting effects. Communities adjusted to absence as much as presence. Remittances became embedded in household strategies. Family structures adapted. Even those who stayed recalibrated expectations around mobility and belonging. Markets adapted structurally. Informal distribution channels matured. New norms emerged around pricing, access, and exchange. These systems proved responsive but difficult to regulate. When formal supply improved, informal networks did not simply disappear. They had become efficient, trusted, and familiar. Public perception of policy shifted accordingly. Announcements were evaluated through the lens of experience. Promises were weighed against contingency plans. People asked not only whether a policy sounded good, but whether it could be navigated if it failed. Skepticism became a form of prudence. Cultural narratives adapted too. Stories emphasized endurance, ingenuity, and realism. Success was reframed as stability rather than expansion. These narratives provided strength, but they also normalized constraint. Ambition adjusted to context. Generational transmission reinforced these patterns. Younger people learned coping strategies from elders shaped by years of adaptation. Expectations were set early. The memory of abundance became abstract, while the practice of improvisation felt concrete and reliable. Institutional recovery faced a paradox. As capacity slowly returned in some areas, participation lagged. People accustomed to informal solutions were cautious about re-engaging. Rebuilding trust required not only improved performance, but sustained consistency over time. Policy design encountered this friction repeatedly. Reforms assumed a return to previous norms. Reality reflected a society that had moved on. Aligning systems with evolved behavior became as important as restoring resources. The persistence of these patterns did not imply failure. It demonstrated learning under pressure. But it did mean that recovery would not be a simple reversal. Path dependence mattered. Choices made during scarcity shaped future possibilities. Understanding this chapter is essential because it explains why improvements did not always translate into relief. The system could change faster than habits. Without addressing both, progress remained partial. As the narrative continues, attention turns to the challenge of rebuilding in this new context. Recovery would require not just investment, but reconciliation between formal systems and the adaptive practices people trusted. This is where the long shadow of crisis becomes clear. Not as a single moment, but as a series of adjustments that, over time, redefine what feels normal. And once normal changes, the path forward must change with it. When conversations eventually turned from survival to recovery, they carried a heavy burden. Recovery was no longer just about restoring systems or stabilizing markets. It was about rebuilding confidence in a society shaped by years of adaptation, loss, and recalibrated expectations. The challenge was not simply economic. It was psychological, social, and deeply historical. Recovery efforts began in a landscape marked by caution. People had learned not to trust sudden improvements. Any sign of stability was tested against memory. Past cycles of promise and disappointment made optimism fragile. Progress was welcomed, but rarely believed without proof over time. Institutions faced the task of reasserting relevance. Capacity could be rebuilt through investment and reform, but legitimacy required consistency. One successful intervention was not enough. Trust demanded repetition. Reliability needed to become routine again, not exceptional. Economic rebuilding required more than reopening supply lines. It demanded the slow reconstruction of production capacity. Skills had to be relearned. Incentives had to change. Risk-taking had to feel reasonable again. This process moved at a pace far slower than public expectation. The memory of dependence lingered. Many remained wary of systems tied too closely to a single source of wealth. The lesson of volatility was deeply internalized. Diversification became a widely accepted goal, but translating agreement into practice proved complex. Households approached recovery strategically. Rather than abandoning adaptive habits, many layered new opportunities on top of old safeguards. Informal networks remained active. Backup plans stayed in place. Trust in formal systems grew gradually, if at all. Public discourse reflected this caution. Conversations emphasized sustainability over speed. Grand promises were met with measured responses. The language of inevitability had lost credibility. Recovery was framed as effort, not destiny. Generational memory shaped this phase strongly. Older generations carried a sense of loss for what had been. Younger ones lacked reference points for abundance and judged recovery by present improvement rather than historical comparison. This divergence influenced political and social priorities. Policy design faced a delicate balance. Moving too fast risked destabilization. Moving too slowly risked frustration. Reforms required sequencing, communication, and visible fairness. Every misstep was magnified by accumulated skepticism. International engagement offered both opportunity and constraint. External support required transparency and reform. Integration demanded alignment with global norms. Each step forward involved negotiation, compromise, and domestic consensus that was difficult to achieve. Cultural attitudes toward success evolved. Stability became a milestone. Predictability felt like progress. Growth was welcomed but not assumed. The emotional tone of recovery was quieter than the optimism of the oil boom years. Education and skill building gained renewed focus, but with practical emphasis. Training aligned more closely with immediate opportunity. Abstract pathways felt risky. Learning was valued for utility as much as aspiration. Community resilience remained a central asset. Networks built during hardship continued to support recovery. Local initiatives often moved faster than national programs. Trust flowed more easily at smaller scales. Yet memory also slowed reintegration. Fear of reversal lingered. Each improvement carried the question of durability. This vigilance protected against disappointment, but it also limited momentum. The concept of normal shifted permanently. Recovery did not mean returning to the past. It meant defining a new baseline shaped by experience. The challenge lay in reconciling caution with ambition. This chapter underscores a quiet truth: crises end before their effects do. Memory outlasts scarcity. Habits persist beyond necessity. Recovery must work with these realities, not against them. As the story moves forward, the final chapters will explore what this experience ultimately leaves behind. Not just in policy or economics, but in identity. How a nation understands itself after abundance, dependence, disruption, and adaptation. Because in the end, recovery is not only about rebuilding what was lost. It is about deciding what should come next, informed by everything learned along the way. Beyond economics and policy, the deepest legacy of this long period of strain settled into identity. Societies are shaped not only by what they build, but by what they endure. Years of adaptation, uncertainty, and recalibration left marks that statistics could never fully capture. They reshaped how people understood themselves, their country, and their place in the world. National identity, once closely tied to abundance and promise, shifted toward endurance. Pride moved away from wealth and toward survival. Stories people told about themselves emphasized resilience, ingenuity, and persistence rather than prosperity. This was not a rejection of the past, but a reinterpretation of it through experience. Collective memory became layered. The era of oil-fueled confidence remained present, but distant, almost unreal to those who had grown up amid constraint. For some, it served as a reminder of loss. For others, as a warning. Memory no longer functioned as nostalgia alone, but as guidance shaped by consequence. Values adjusted accordingly. Security was prized over excess. Reliability mattered more than spectacle. Modesty replaced expectation. These shifts influenced everything from career choices to political attitudes. Ambition did not disappear, but it became more cautious, more conditional. The meaning of success evolved. It was no longer measured primarily by accumulation or status, but by stability and autonomy. Being able to plan even a short distance into the future felt like achievement. Predictability became a form of wealth. Community bonds deepened in many places. Shared hardship created shared understanding. Empathy grew within groups that had navigated similar challenges. At the same time, divisions persisted where experiences differed sharply. Identity became more localized, shaped by region, class, and access. Migration left a permanent imprint. Families stretched across borders carried blended identities. Remittances became more than economic support. They were emotional ties. The idea of belonging expanded beyond geography. Home became both a place and a network. Language itself reflected change. Everyday expressions absorbed themes of improvisation, caution, and realism. Humor adapted to uncertainty. Communication became practical, focused on what worked rather than what was promised. Trust was redefined. Blind confidence faded. Conditional trust took its place. Institutions were judged by consistency rather than intention. People learned to verify, to prepare alternatives, to rely on layered systems of support. This mindset increased resilience but reduced ease. Political identity grew more complex. Simple narratives struggled to hold. Experience had introduced nuance. Certainty felt fragile. Ideological extremes lost some appeal, even as polarization remained present. People weighed claims against memory. Cultural production captured these tensions. Art, music, and storytelling reflected endurance and reflection. Themes of waiting, adapting, and persisting appeared repeatedly. These expressions preserved experience and made it shareable across generations. Perhaps most importantly, expectations were permanently recalibrated. The belief that progress was automatic faded. The understanding that systems require care, diversification, and accountability took root. These lessons were not academic. They were lived. This legacy is neither entirely bleak nor purely hopeful. It is complex. It carries loss and wisdom together. The experience narrowed certain possibilities while opening others grounded in realism. Understanding this identity shift is essential to understanding the future. Policy can rebuild infrastructure. Investment can restore capacity. But identity shapes how those changes are received, sustained, or resisted. As the story approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. After abundance and dependence, collapse and adaptation, what does renewal truly mean? Not just materially, but culturally and psychologically. The answer lies not in erasing the past, but in integrating it. In allowing memory to inform choice without paralyzing action. In using endurance as a foundation, not a ceiling. This is the quiet inheritance of crisis. Not just what was lost, but what was learned. And it is from this inheritance that any lasting future must be built. At the end of this long arc, the question is no longer why the crisis happened, nor even how deeply it reshaped society. The question becomes what comes after understanding. Because once experience has rewritten assumptions, the future is no longer inherited automatically. It has to be chosen. For Venezuela, this choice exists in tension between memory and possibility. The past offers both warning and knowledge. The oil era demonstrated how abundance can accelerate progress, but also how easily it can distort priorities. The crisis revealed the cost of dependence, but also the strength of adaptation. Neither period alone defines the future. What matters is how their lessons are combined. One of the most enduring lessons is the value of balance. Abundance without preparation creates fragility. Scarcity without coordination creates exhaustion. A sustainable path lies between the two, grounded in diversification, institutional strength, and realistic expectations. This is not an abstract ideal. It is a practical conclusion drawn from lived experience. Rebuilding after such a journey requires patience that is difficult to sustain. Progress will likely be uneven. Some areas will recover faster than others. Setbacks will occur. What distinguishes renewal from repetition is not perfection, but correction, the ability to adjust without denial. Institutions, if they are to regain trust, must prove reliability over time. Not through grand announcements, but through consistency. Predictable rules. Transparent processes. Accountability that does not depend on circumstances. Trust, once broken, returns slowly, but it does return when experience changes. Economic recovery, too, demands a shift in mindset. Production must regain value, not just rhetorically, but materially. Making things again: food, services, Ideas reconnects effort to outcome. It restores the link between work and security that dependence had weakened. This does not mean rejecting oil or natural wealth. It means repositioning it. Resources become tools rather than foundations. Support rather than substitute. A diversified economy is not immune to shocks, but it absorbs them differently. It bends instead of breaking. Social expectations also play a defining role. A society shaped by uncertainty will not easily embrace unchecked optimism again. That caution can be an asset. It encourages scrutiny, debate, and planning. The challenge is preventing caution from turning into paralysis. Education becomes central in this phase, not only formal education, but civic learning. Understanding how systems work, how choices carry consequences, and how participation matters helps transform memory into agency. Knowledge becomes a form of resilience. Leadership, in this context, is less about promise and more about credibility. Less about control and more about coordination. Guiding a society that has learned to survive requires humility and listening. Authority must align with experience, not override it. Community networks, forged in hardship, remain valuable. They can support recovery if integrated rather than ignored. Renewal that builds on existing strengths moves faster than renewal that attempts to reset everything. Perhaps the most important shift is psychological. The future is no longer imagined as guaranteed. It is understood as conditional. This awareness changes behavior. It encourages care, maintenance, and foresight. It reframes progress as something earned and protected. The story that began with confidence in the ground ends with confidence in learning. Not blind confidence, but informed belief. The understanding that no resource replaces judgment. No abundance replaces structure. No system sustains itself without attention. This does not mean the past was meaningless. On the contrary, it was instructive. The oil boom, the collapse, the adaptation all form a continuous education. The cost was high, but the insight is deep. In the end, Venezuela's story is not simply about loss or failure. It is about transformation under pressure. About how a nation responds when its assumptions break. And about the quiet, difficult work of deciding what to do once they have. The future, then, is not a return to what was, nor a rejection of it. It is a choice shaped by memory, restraint, and possibility. A future built not on certainty, but on awareness. And that awareness, hard-earned, deeply felt, is the final legacy of this journey. As we step back from the full arc of this story, one truth becomes clear. This was never just a story about oil, economics, or political decisions. It was a story about expectations, how they are formed, how they are tested, and how they evolve under pressure. Venezuela's journey shows us what happens when certainty replaces caution, and what people are capable of when that certainty disappears. From abundance to collapse, and from collapse to adaptation, every phase left behind a lesson. Dependence revealed its limits. Crisis exposed hidden strengths. Survival reshaped values. What remains is not a simple warning or a single solution, but a deeper understanding of balance, resilience, and responsibility. This story reminds us that progress is fragile when it is not supported by structure, and that recovery is possible when experience is taken seriously. The future is not something that simply arrives, it is something that must be built carefully, with memory as a guide rather than a burden. In the end, this is a human story. About communities that adjusted when systems failed. About individuals who redefined stability when old guarantees vanished. And about a society learning, slowly and painfully, that awareness can be as valuable as wealth. Thank you for spending this time with us, for listening, and for reflecting along the way. If this story gave you something to think about, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep, thoughtful journeys into history and the forces that shape our world. See you in the next story.